The room didn't go quiet when the gun came out. It went dead. Not the kind of silence where people stop talking, the kind where breathing feels too loud, where time seems to slow down, where every man in the room understands that history is about to be decided in the next few seconds. It was late on October 15th, 1935, inside a private suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. The lights were low. The air was thick with cigar smoke. 12 men sat around a long table, the most powerful figures in American organized crime. Every one of them armed, every one of them dangerous. This was the Mafia Commission, created to prevent bloodshed, to replace chaos with order. And now, that order was collapsing. At one end of the room, a chair scraped sharply against the floor. The sound cut through the smoke like a warning shot. A man stood up fast, his face flushed, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. His hand moved inside his jacket. Everyone knew that motion. A .45 automatic came out, cold steel catching the light. The man holding it didn't hesitate. He raised the gun and aimed it directly at Lucky Luciano's head. 3 feet. Point blank. No cover. No warning. No room for error. For a split second, no one reacted. Not because they were slow, but because they were experienced enough to understand that one wrong move could turn the room into a slaughterhouse. 12 armed men, one trigger pull away from a war that would never end. Lucky Luciano didn't move. He didn't push his chair back. He didn't reach for his own weapon. He didn't even lean away from the gun aimed at his face. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the man holding the .45. Calm, focused, unafraid. This wasn't the first time Lucky had been close to death. But this was different. This wasn't an ambush in the street. This wasn't knives in the dark. This was an execution waiting to happen in front of witnesses, in front of the very system Lucky had spent years building. The men around the table felt it, the weight of the moment. They weren't just watching a murder about to happen. They were watching the possible end of the commission itself. If that trigger was pulled, the rules died with Lucky Luciano. And without rules, there was nothing left but chaos. The gunman's finger rested on the trigger. His breathing was heavy now, controlled but furious. This wasn't a threat. This was a challenge. A declaration that fear still ruled this world. Not votes, not discussions, not systems. Still, Lucky didn't blink. The silence stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. Every man in the room understood the unspoken truth. This moment would decide what kind of organization they were going to be. One ruled by rage, or one ruled by restraint. Outside the hotel, New York City carried on like nothing was happening. Cars moved, people laughed, lights flickered on and off in nearby buildings. The world had no idea that inside this suite, the future of organized crime was hanging by a thread. The gun stayed raised. The room stayed frozen. And then, Lucky Luciano opened his mouth. What he said next wouldn't just save his life. It would change everything. The gun didn't come out because of anger. Not at first. It came out because someone in that room was running out of time. For months, the pressure had been building. Quietly, relentlessly. A kind of pressure that didn't explode all at once, but tightened day by day until there was no room left to breathe. Outside the underworld, a new kind of enemy was rising. One who didn't care about reputations, or fear, or the old rules that had protected men like these for decades. A prosecutor. Young, ambitious, incorruptible. He didn't take envelopes. He didn't return phone calls. He didn't scare easily. Instead, he built cases slowly, methodically, following money trails, flipping insiders, stacking evidence, piece by piece. While most lawmen chased headlines, he chased convictions. And it was working. For the Mafia, that was terrifying. But for one man in particular, it was catastrophic. The man who would eventually raise the gun knew exactly what was coming. Ledgers had been seized. Witnesses were talking. Accountants who had stayed silent for years were suddenly cooperating. This wasn't a rumor or a scare tactic. This was real. And it pointed in only one direction. Prison, not a short sentence, not a deal. Decades. Enough time for power to evaporate, for allies to disappear, for a name to be forgotten. For a man who had ruled through fear, prison wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. That kind of future makes men desperate. In the old days, there was a simple solution to problems like this. You removed them. A prosecutor could be scared, a judge could be bribed, and if neither worked, there was always the final option: violence. One clean hit, made to look random, and the problem went away. That was the world this man understood. But Lucky Luciano had built something new, something that didn't bend easily to panic. The commission existed for one reason: to stop individual desperation from destroying everyone else. No more impulsive hits, no more personal wars, no moves that brought heat down on all the families. To Lucky, killing a prosecutor wasn't strength. It was suicide. That difference in thinking was the real reason the gun came out. To the man who would pull it, the commission felt like a cage. Too many rules, too much talking, too much restraint. While his world was collapsing, everyone else wanted to vote, discuss, wait, and waiting felt like surrender. In his mind, Lucky wasn't protecting the organization. He was sacrificing him. Every argument against violence sounded like betrayal. Every reminder of consequences felt like cowardice. And every vote against action felt like the system choosing its own survival over his. That kind of realization doesn't just anger a man like that. It breaks him. The gun wasn't raised to threaten Lucky Luciano. It wasn't raised to scare the room. It was raised because the old world was slipping away, and one man refused to go quietly with it. He believed that if fear no longer ruled, then nothing did. So when the vote went against him, when the system said no, something snapped. Not rage, but desperation sharpened into resolve. If rules were going to let him die slowly, then rules meant nothing. That's why the gun came out. Not because he wanted to kill Lucky Luciano, but because he couldn't accept a world where he no longer had the power to decide who lived and who didn't. The commission existed to stop moments like this. That was the promise. After years of bloody wars and reckless decisions, this system was supposed to keep tempers in check and protect the organization from itself. Rules instead of vendettas, votes instead of violence. But that night, inside the Waldorf suite, those rules were standing on the edge of collapse. The proposal had already been made. It was simple, final: kill the prosecutor and end the threat. To the man who suggested it, this wasn't madness. It was survival. In his world, problems were meant to be eliminated, not debated. And as the room absorbed what was being asked, the tension thickened. Lucky Luciano listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that power wasn't about speaking first. When he finally responded, his voice was calm, measured, almost disappointing in its lack of drama. He didn't talk about fear or morality. He talked about consequences, about federal attention, about the kind of heat that didn't fade with time, about how one reckless act could bring down every family represented at that table. This wasn't personal. This was math. Others spoke up, not loudly, not emotionally. They echoed Lucky's logic. Killing a public figure wouldn't solve anything. It would turn the mafia into a national target. The commission wasn't created to protect individual bosses from their own mistakes. It was created to protect the system. That was when the divide became clear. On one side sat men who believed survival depended on restraint. On the other sat a man who believed restraint was a death sentence. To him, every argument against violence sounded like abandonment. While his world was closing in, everyone else wanted patience, discussion, time. Time was something he didn't have. When Lucky finally called for a vote, the room fell into an uneasy stillness. This was the moment where talk ended and authority spoke. One by one, The men around the table made their choice. Hands rose slowly, deliberately. The result was devastating. The decision was nearly unanimous. The plan was rejected. The rules stood. For a second, it looked like the system had worked, like the commission had done exactly what it was designed to do. Then a chair scraped back violently, and the illusion shattered. The man who had lost the vote stood up, his face flushed with disbelief and rage. This wasn't just disagreement. This was humiliation. The system had spoken, and it had spoken against him. In his eyes, that meant the system was broken. He cursed the rules, mocked the idea of votes and discussions, accused Lucky of forgetting what this life was built on. Blood, not ballots. Fear, not patience. His voice grew louder, sharper, cutting through the room. Lucky stayed seated. That was what made it worse. He reminded him of the vote. Calmly, firmly. 11-1. This was how things worked now. The decision was final. That sentence landed harder than any insult, because in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. The rules were no longer suggestions. They were authority, and authority no longer belonged to the loudest man in the room. That was the moment the rules were truly challenged, not by debate, not by dissent, but by refusal. Hands drifted closer to jackets, eyes locked across the table. Every man there understood the danger. When someone rejects the system openly, there are only two possible outcomes. The system breaks, or the man does. As the tension stretched and the air grew heavier, one thing became clear. The vote hadn't ended the conflict. It had brought it to the brink. The gun was fully raised now, not wavering, not shaking. A .45 automatic aimed directly at Lucky Luciano's head from 3 feet away, close enough that there would be no warning, no reaction time, no second chance. One squeeze of the trigger, and Lucky would die right there in his chair, in front of the men who had helped him build the commission. The room was frozen. No one reached for their own weapon. No one stood up. Every man in that suite understood the same thing at the same time. If anyone moved, this wouldn't be a murder. It would be a massacre. 12 armed men, trapped in a small room, panic turning into chaos in seconds. This wasn't a threat anymore. This was an execution waiting for permission from a finger. Lucky Luciano didn't move. He didn't lean back. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't look away from the gun. He sat exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, studying the man holding his life in his hands. To anyone watching, it didn't look like courage. It looked like certainty. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Then Lucky spoke. His voice was quiet, calm, almost conversational. Not the voice of a man begging for his life, not the voice of a man issuing a threat. It was the voice of someone explaining a simple fact. "You pull that trigger," Lucky said, "and you better kill every man in this room." For the first time since the gun came out, something changed. The man holding the weapon hesitated, just slightly, a fraction of a second, but everyone saw it. Lucky continued, his tone unchanged. He explained what would happen next, not emotionally, not dramatically, logically. The moment Lucky died, the commission wouldn't collapse. It would harden. 11 families would turn into 11 enemies. Every dollar they had, every soldier they controlled, every favor they'd ever earned would be spent on one goal: revenge. Even if the gunman somehow walked out of that room alive, he wouldn't stay alive for long. There would be no hiding, no protection, no forgiveness. Killing Lucky wouldn't make him powerful. It would make him a dead man who just didn't know it yet. "You're not killing a boss," Lucky said. "You're killing the system." That was the sentence, the one that changed everything, because it forced the truth into the open. This wasn't about pride anymore, or fear, or anger. This was about inevitability, the realization that the rules were real now, that the commission wasn't just an idea or a discussion group. It was authority, and authority didn't die with one man. Meyer Lansky finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. He told him to put the gun down, not as a plea, as a reminder, Others stayed silent, but their faces said enough. No one was backing him. No one was following him into this. The gun hand began to tremble, not from fear, from understanding. Seconds dragged by. The weight of the decision pressed down on everyone in the room. This was the moment when the Mafia would decide whether it was ruled by impulse or by discipline. Slowly, painfully, the gun lowered. It wasn't dramatic, no apology, no explanation. Just the quiet acceptance that the game had changed, and the old rules no longer applied. The weapon slipped back into the jacket, suddenly useless. Lucky Luciano hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened violence. He hadn't ordered anyone to act. He had spoken one sentence. And that sentence proved something no gun ever could. Real power wasn't pulling the trigger. It was knowing that you didn't need to. The gun went back into the jacket, but nothing went back to the way it was before. The meeting didn't end with shouting or violence. It ended quietly, almost calmly. But every man in that room understood that something irreversible had just happened. A line had been crossed, challenged, and reinforced without a single shot being fired. The commission had survived its most dangerous test, and in doing so, it had proven it was real. The man who raised the gun didn't argue anymore. There was nothing left to argue. He stood there for a moment, looking around the room, seeing what he hadn't wanted to see before. No allies, no support. No fear in their eyes, just acceptance of a new reality. The system would not bend for him, and it would not protect him if he tried to break it again. When he finally turned and walked out, he walked alone. No one followed, no one stopped him. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed louder than the gun ever had. That was the sound of the old world ending, a world where rage could override reason, where the loudest voice won, where fear alone kept men in line. Inside the room, no one celebrated. Lucky Luciano didn't smile. He didn't claim victory. He didn't even acknowledge what he had just done. Because for him, this wasn't about winning an argument or humiliating an enemy. It was about proving that the structure mattered more than any individual. And that proof would have consequences. Within days, it became clear that the commission would enforce its authority, not loudly, not publicly, quietly, efficiently. The man who had pulled the gun had made himself a liability, not because of his temper, but because he had shown he valued his own survival over the survival of the organization. That could never be allowed to stand. Soon after, he was gone. There was no announcement, no explanation, no official acknowledgement. The commission didn't need to say anything. Everyone understood the message. No one was above the rules, not even the most feared man in the room, especially not him. What that sentence created wasn't just a moment of survival for Lucky Luciano. It created a new kind of power in organized crime. Power that didn't rely on constant violence. Power that came from predictability, from discipline, from knowing that decisions would be made collectively and enforced without hesitation. From that night forward, the Mafia changed. Public wars became rare. Impulsive hits became unacceptable. Disputes moved into closed rooms instead of spilling into the streets. Violence didn't disappear, but it became controlled, calculated, purposeful. The organization became quieter, more patient, and far more dangerous because it had learned restraint. Even when Lucky himself later went to prison, the system didn't collapse. That was the ultimate proof. Meetings continued. Votes were taken. Rules were followed. The commission outlived its creator, exactly as he had intended. That is what that sentence created. Not just safety for one man, but stability for an entire organization. Not fear, but order. Not chaos, but law. The night a Mafia gun was raised could have ended in blood. Instead, it ended in transformation. A single sentence turned a moment of near death into a foundation for decades of control. That night, the Mafia didn't choose mercy. It chose structure. And once that choice was made, there was no going back.